Hello and welcome back to the 20th full episode of The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. To those of you who have been following the podcast since episode 1, thank you for all your support so far. To those listening for the first time, I hope you enjoy this. And remember, you can find me by searching The Hated and the Dead on Twitter and Instagram. Today's episode concerns the current Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. Hasina's life can be read as a tragedy. In 1975, when she was 28, her entire family was murdered in a military coup, including Sheikh Mujib, her father, and the leader of the Bangladeshi independence movement. Unsurprisingly, this had a huge impact on Hasina's life and politics, and in the 1980s she fought to restore Bangladeshi democracy. Whilst she was initially successful in doing this, Hasina has been Prime Minister for 18 out of the last 26 years, and the later years of her rule have been marred, yes, by allegations of election fraud, but more worryingly by extrajudicial killings and torture by the state security services. These activities have now caught the attention of the US State Department, who in 2021 issued sanctions against the so-called Rapid Action Battalion. I have to say, I'm still not entirely sure how Hasina has become the authoritarian dictator she is today, though I am under the impression that the brutality of the security services, which has persisted under multiple different regimes, might well be bigger than any one leader or government. My guest for this conversation is Tasneem Khalil, a Bangladeshi author and journalist who has been forced to leave his homeland after suffering at the hands of the state security services. We discuss the violence and trauma that brought Bangladesh into existence in 1971, the relative success of Hasina's authoritarian strategy compared to her father's, and the attitude of the sizable British Bangladeshi community towards their homeland's Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Sheikh Hasina. Good afternoon, how are you, Tasneem?
I'm doing good, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. You're in Sweden or in London?
I'm in Malmö, in Sweden.
The subject of our conversation today, Tasneem, is Sheikh Hasina. She's the current Prime Minister of Bangladesh. She's actually the longest-serving female head of state in the world. She's been in power since 2009. She was also in power for 5 years during the 90s. She's the daughter of the founding father of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujib. Bangladesh only became an independent country in 1971. It's quite a new country. Previous to that, it was part of Pakistan. I know this is a big question, but can you give an account of Mujib's importance to the movement for Bangladeshi independence, just to set the scene a bit?
Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the founding father, as you mentioned, of Bangladesh, and he led the movement for independence from Pakistan. What we now know as Bangladesh was known as East Pakistan since 1947 up until 1971, when Bangladesh gained its independence. Some years prior to that, Sheikh Mujib started this movement for self-rule of the Bengali people. Mostly he was asking for, sort of an administrative independence for the people of Bangladesh. He was not necessarily asking for a new country. But eventually, when the Pakistani army decided to crack down on this movement of Bengali nationalists, Bangladesh eventually broke away from Pakistan and became an independent nation. And Sheikh Mujib, during the 9 months of the War of Independence, Sheikh Mujib was in Pakistani prison. So, though we call him the founding father of Bangladesh, actually Bangladesh had several founding fathers. And those were his closest political associates. I can talk about Tajuddin Ahmed and Syed Nazrul Islam, who were like the actual leaders of the War of Independence. They formed a government in exile in India and then led the country towards independence while Sheikh Mujib was in prison. And then in 1972, Sheikh Mujib comes back from Pakistan to Bangladesh and takes over as the new ruler of the newly independent country.
Thank you. The struggle for Bangladeshi independence is an amazing story, and Mujib is also a fascinating person to read about. If nothing else, the independence story is notable for the shocking violence that the Bangladeshi people experienced at the hand of the Pakistanis. Hasina was born in 1947, so she reached her formative years when Mujib was becoming an icon for Bangladeshi independence. What do you think it was like for Hasina to have a father that was so well known and so loved by Bangladeshis in the 60s? How did she react to that as a young woman, and how did she involve herself in her father's political career?
Hasina was, as far as I know, she was not necessarily politically active at that time. I mean, she was not a leader of Awami League or Chhatra League. I mean, later she claimed that she was very politically conscious. And obviously, like, if you have a father who is like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and he's definitely, he's leading this movement, he's getting arrested on and off, spending time in prison. Obviously, that is going to affect the daughter. That much happened, but we don't know of Hasina as a politically very active person at that time. I mean, she was just a normal civilian, not known politically.
I think I know the event, or I can guess the event which perhaps changed that. I mean, Mujib became the leader of the newly independent Bangladesh, as you said, in 1972. But the early years of the country were very difficult. Extreme poverty, other economic difficulties. Obviously, Bangladesh is not a wealthy country. It had a great deal of resources denied to it by West Pakistan after 1947. And Mujib's leadership unravelled into one-party government. But Mujib was assassinated in 1975 as part of a military coup. Hasina was in Germany at the time that happened. It was presumably out of the question that she went back to Bangladesh in 1975. How did that affect her?
We can very clearly see that event affected her very negatively and psychologically. I mean, it crippled her in so many ways, because that's the event, the slaughter of not only her father, but also her mother, her brothers, her sisters-in-law, and then one of her brothers, the youngest one, Sheikh Russell, was, I think, 7 or 6 years old at that time when the whole family was slaughtered by these coup makers. That definitely is the event that shapes her political ideology, the way she looks at the world, the way she looks at Bangladesh, the way she looks at Bengali people, or the people of Bangladesh. You mentioned, that, she was the daughter of a very celebrated politician who was very popular. Everyone loved him. Then what happens after 1972, when Mujib becomes the ruler of Bangladesh? As you rightly pointed out, it was a one-party dictatorship. It was a one-party police state in many ways, extremely violent. There was a famine going on right then, and people were dying. And then there was a death squad called Rokhi Bahini that Mujib used to use against his political opponents. So, I mean, everything indicated that he was a ruthless leader and a very unpopular leader. So after his very gruesome assassination, very unfortunate and gruesome, brutal slaughter of the whole family, there were people in Bangladesh who were actually celebrating that. They were really happy that this ruler has died. And all of that Hasina has witnessed. I mean, even from exile. She was in Germany, and later she actually moved to India, where she lived for some years as a refugee in political asylum. So that whole episode basically shaped Hasina's political program in a way. I mean, even now when she talks, it's all about her father. She thinks, I mean, it's not a secret that when she's talking to people in her, if we analyze her public speeches and all that, we see that she thinks that it is Sheikh Mujibur Rahman who has somehow gifted this country to the people of Bangladesh. And, unfortunately, they are a very unthankful bunch who eventually killed her father. So you can very clearly see the anger she has. Sometimes she actually fails to sort of hide that. But I'm sure we'll be discussing this very in detail here. I think Sheikh Hasina is actually like the successful version of Sheikh Mujib. I mean, what Sheikh Mujib failed to do in Bangladesh, what Sheikh Mujib failed to do, like in his politics, he failed to create and sustain this one-party police state, which he very much wanted to. Sheikh Hasina has actually succeeded in doing that. So she is a much more mature, much more, efficient politician, much more ruthless than her father. And she's the successful version of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman.
That's a very thought-provoking observation, and I want to come back to that later. Bangladesh entered a period of instability after 1975, so where I think, multiple different governments, more assassinations as we move into the 1980s. Hasina became the president of the Awami League at the start of the 1980s. The Awami League, I think you mentioned a second ago, was Sheikh Mujib's political party. It was the movement for Bangladeshi autonomy. What was the nature of the instability that Bangladesh experienced after 1975? Was it economic, or was it essentially a political crisis?
Bangladesh underwent lots of challenges politically. You had successive military regimes. The major ones, one by Ziaur Rahman, General Ziaur Rahman. He himself was a freedom fighter. He was one of the sector commanders during the War of Liberation. He was, he sort of arranged himself to get elected as the president of the country. And he ruled for a few years. And then he was assassinated, and then eventually General Ershad, the longest running military dictator of Bangladesh, took power. And he ruled for a few years before he was ousted in 1990. During that time, so we are talking about 1977 to 1990, Bangladesh was, officially a military dictatorship. But obviously, economically, Bangladesh was, still progressing. It did better than Pakistan in so many indexes, right? Human Development Index, for example. And then, relatively, I would say that now, in retrospect, when we look back, Bangladeshi citizens were comparatively freer under the military dictatorship than, like they are today. It's, we have sort of, formally electoral democracy right now, which is, just a sham. But at that time, there was political instability. There was massive human rights violations, especially in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, where the army was prosecuting a counter insurgency operation against the Jumma people. These are the indigenous Jumma people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts, killing and maiming and raping thousands and thousands of Jumma men and women. It was a very violent counterinsurgency campaign going on. So that was between 1975 to 1990.
Bangladesh is seen by some as having become more or transitioned to a more democratic state in the early 1990s. It adopted a new system of government in 1991, or rather it kind of reverted to the pre-75 parliamentary system that Mujib had originally put in place. I'm interested to see where Hasina comes into this transition. How far do you think you can credit the Awami League and Hasina, to the extent that those two things are the same? Let me know if they're not. How far can you credit them with that process of democratization? Obviously, they'd been out of power during the dictatorship.
No, Hasina obviously was a Democrat. I mean, just like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was a Democrat before he came to power. Bangladesh, I really don't see. I mean, in the real sense, electoral democracy or a liberal democracy took root in Bangladesh in 1991 when BNP was elected to power. That was a free and fair election after General Ershad was ousted. Hasina, lost the elections to Khaleda Zia, her arch rival, and to BNP, which is right now the main opposition party. I will credit both Hasina and Khaleda as the two politicians who actually led Bangladesh and Bangladeshi people in this struggle for democracy, in the real sense. And Hasina was definitely, until recently, until she was re-elected as a prime minister in 2008, 2009. Before that, when she was in opposition, and even before that, when she was prime minister in her first term, she was a Democrat, and she was the person who was one of the torchbearers of human rights and rule of law and liberal values. But something drastically changed from 2008 onwards.
You mentioned Khaleda Zia?
Khaleda Zia, yes.
Khaleda Zia, there, yeah. Also, another female politician, as you said, Hasina's arch rival, really.
And she is the Khaleda, by the way, is the widow of General Ziaur Rahman, who was the assassinated military dictator of Bangladesh. So it's a very, these are all between families, yes.
Yes, and that's very much something that is a feature not just of Bangladeshi politics, but of politics in Sri Lanka and Pakistan and India as well, in all of South Asia. I've actually done a podcast on Indira Gandhi before, which people should go and listen to. But it's easy to kind of, I guess it's possibly easy to fall into comparisons between Hasina and Indira Gandhi.
Absolutely.
Because they're both daughters of and heirs to the founding fathers of their nations, Bangladesh and India. Gandhi is remembered for being quite a prickly, paranoid, intense character. Do you think that you could describe Hasina in a similar way?
We're forgetting another very interesting character in the region, and that is Aung San Suu Kyi. She is also the daughter of another military general and a Democrat. And later she turned out to be one of the cheerleaders of a genocide which went on. Hasina, I don't really think that Hasina has that kind of intellectual depth like Indira Gandhi. She's a very shrewd politician, but Indira definitely, intellectually was richer. Obviously, she was Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter, right? But also very suave as a politician. But Hasina, I don't really think that there is a comparison between these two. Hasina is more like a very street smart politician. She understands the people of Bangladesh. She understands, the foibles of the people of Bangladesh very well. And she has somehow surrounded herself with very good advisors. There are many political mistakes she has done that Indira Gandhi would not have, done in retrospect if we were thinking. So I'm not sure that we can actually compare these two as, politicians. Indira Gandhi definitely had her autocratic stint during the emergency, right? But I don't think Hasina is comparable.
And Indira Gandhi emerged from the period of autocracy.
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi there. Do you bring that up because you think there's more of a comparison to be made?
Exactly. We have a situation where you have a leader who has, who has been at the forefront of a movement, a struggle for democracy in her country, of her people, for a long time. And then when she somehow manages to come to power, becomes a partner of the military, becomes a partner of the security establishment, and starts cheerleading. In case of Hasina, she's the principal patron of the repression that goes on in Bangladesh, in today's Bangladesh. Aung San Suu Kyi, on the other hand, she did not have that kind of power, even when she was the I just forgot the exact position she had. State something. So Aung San Suu Kyi was more like a cheerleader for the military. She would go to The Hague and appear before the International Court of Justice, arguing for the Myanmar military who are accused of conducting a genocide against the Rohingya people. But definitely there are parallels. We can very clearly see that these are two leaders, female, daughters of the founding fathers of a country, themselves led movements of democracies in their own countries, and eventually they become part of the, eventually they become monsters, right? So that's the parallel I can see here.
Hasina's been Prime Minister two different times, as I said at the beginning, between 1996 and 2001, and then again between 2009 and the present day. I think one of the most significant moments of her life came between those two non-consecutive spells as Prime Minister, and that was, it happened in 2004. Can you tell us about the attempt on her life in 2004?
Yet in 2004, there was an assassination attempt against her. She was speaking at a rally in Dhaka, the capital, and suddenly, assassins started throwing grenades at the rally. Some of her closest political allies, including Ivy Rahman, died on this. In that attack. She was miraculously saved by her people, but she was seriously injured. I think she lost hearing in one of her ears because of that attack, and she holds BNP responsible for that attack, for that assassination attempt on her. She personally holds Khaleda Zia and her son Tariq Rahman, who is right now in exile in London, as responsible for that attack. And there was a court case which also found Tariq Rahman guilty of that attack, though the quality of the trial is questionable.
Do you think that this assassination attempt can be seen as a cause of her further embracing of authoritarian politics?
It's very difficult to, psychoanalyze her in this way, to see how exactly she reacted to it. Because immediately after the attack, she did not change her position vis-a-vis democracy, vis-a-vis human rights. That was in her party program. Awami League won the 2008 elections with one of the most progressive, forward-looking, liberal manifestos. They were talking about, stopping extrajudicial executions, women's freedom, rights for the indigenous people, stuff like that. It was very forward-looking, very progressive, very liberal. Then when they win in a landslide elections in 2008, something starts changing. So I'm not entirely sure what happened there, why exactly she started, very visibly taking other paths, like the opposite direction. A Democrat marching towards becoming an authoritarian, if I can describe it that way. But obviously, what we can see, now if we look at her public speeches and all that, it's not necessarily August 21, the 2004 assassination attack, that she talks about. She talks about it sometimes, but her main talking point, her main point of departure whenever she is talking is actually the assassination of her father and the family. It's not the attempt on her life.
So we've talked about the authoritarianism that has engulfed Bangladesh as in Hasina's kind of second term. Let's be a bit more specific, Tasneem. What privations have been put on ordinary citizens? I know you have your own experience with the Bangladeshi authorities. Tasneem, you're Bangladeshi yourself, of course. I don't want to sort of put you under any pressure to talk or not talk about that, so that's up to you. But if somebody in Bangladesh criticizes Hasina or organizes against her government, what's likely to happen to them?
Okay, since you bring up my case, I would just give a little note on that here so that there is no confusion. I was sort of kicked out of Bangladesh in 2007 when Hasina was not in power. I was detained and tortured by the Military Intelligence Agency, the DGFI, and that was because of my journalism highlighting extrajudicial executions and other abuses by the security forces in the country, especially Rapid Action Battalion. When it comes to Hasina and Awami League, I had the most wonderful relationship with them, Hasina and her family. I never had any problem from them. I actually, I think as a Bangladeshi citizen, I could vote 2 or 3 times in the elections since I became 18. And I always voted for Awami League. So I was a supporter of Awami League and Hasina and an admirer of Hasina. So I didn't have any kind of, problems because of Sheikh Hasina or because of Awami League. That I want to make very clear here. So the way I'm commenting here, the position I'm commenting here from is from an objective journalist, objective analyst of the situation. Right now, it also gives me the chance to say that Bangladesh's human rights record under successive governments were not really perfect. We see a progression with the BNP coming into power in 2001. Massive problems with human rights violations, especially the persecution of minority Hindu communities. Then there was an operation called Operation Clean Heart, which was conducted by the Bangladesh Army. It was just systematic campaign of extrajudicial executions. In other words, people were tortured to death, and then the government actually gave indemnity to whoever took part in that campaign. And then Khaleda Zia herself created this death squad called Rapid Action Battalion. Hasina, interestingly, was one of the staunchest critique of Rapid Action Battalion back in 2006, 7, 5, when Rapid Action Battalion was created. Then like moving on to the present days, which we can say it started in 2008. I mean, right now the situation is that Bangladesh has become a one-party police state, and one party, the party being Awami League, which is in a very tightly knit partnership with the police forces. You have the Rapid Action Battalion, you have the army, you have the regular police, and you have other agencies. So one of the things that Hasina and her people has established is that they do not allow any kind of criticism of her father, and I mean, if any citizen dares to do that, they are subjected to very dire consequences. I say something, like in Bangladesh today, you really cannot say anything about 3 A's. Okay? So, number one is Allah. You cannot say anything that is going to anger the majority Sunni Muslim population. Number two is Awami League, which is the party. You cannot say anything about Awami League and its leader and the great prophet who is known as Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and also Sheikh Hasina, the current matriarch of the party, and then army. You cannot criticize. You cannot say anything about the army. So these 3 A's are the untouchable, above everything figures in Bangladesh. You cannot criticize them. So number one is the serious serious restrictions on freedom of expression. Number two is a huge problem with systematic violation of human rights that some human rights organizations actually describe as crimes against humanity. So you have like more than 600 people who have disappeared. I mean, these are people who were abducted by different law enforcement agencies, different security agencies. Many of them were actually killed. Many of them we don't know where they are. Many of them were eventually brought out. There was this systematic campaign of enforced disappearances going on in Bangladesh since 2013. Then Hasina has actually continued the campaign of extrajudicial executions that actually started with Khaleda Zia. So that started sometime in 2005, 2006. That has continued under Hasina, and it has actually the numbers have actually grown by the months. So we have these problems, and then we have endemic corruption in Bangladesh. I mean, everyone in Bangladesh, most of the political leaders, MPs, civil servants, they're very much involved in corruption. And another thing is that you cannot actually talk about that. You cannot actually, say that these people are looting public resources and just wasting taxpayers' money, or they're just funneling off this money to somewhere else, from Bangladesh to some place in the West.
You said earlier in the conversation that Hasina is like a more efficient and successful Mujib in terms of the way that he has cracked down on the population and controlled the population. Why do you think that is? Do you think that it's just a matter of her being shrewder, her surrounding herself with cannier people? Or do you think it might just be luck that, Mujib was actually dealt a very poor hand of cards in the early 70s? He inherited a very difficult situation after the war, and he would have found himself out of power very quickly anyway because of that. regardless of what route regarding democracy he would have taken?
No, I think, the way we can analyze this whole thing, if we look at Mujib's failure, let's start with the people who actually killed him. These were former freedom fighters who took part in the liberation war and later, joined Bangladesh army. So these are Pakistan army officers who defected to Bangladeshi side, and then they become Bangladesh army officers. And eventually, they end up killing the founding father of the nation, right? I think one of Sheikh Mujib's wrong move was that we have to remember Mujib as a politician, he was very anti-military because he was dealing with the Pakistani army throughout his career as a politician. And he didn't like the idea of a, military in that way. So Mujib actually did not take the military into confidence. And that's why, as an alternative, repressive force, he created the Rukhi Bahini, to serve his political purposes. I think that was, cynically speaking, that was a wrong move on his part, because he did not, enter into the kind of partnership between the army and the dictator you actually need in these kind of regimes. That is number one. And number two, Mujib was not really, efficient when it came to international relations. Because I, for example, in my book, where I actually, trace the genealogy of death squads in 5 South Asian countries, I make a point that if one state wants to engage in state terror, that state actually needs to be a client state of a hegemon, a regional hegemon, or a international, global hegemon. So if you are a dictator in, say, Syria, you cannot actually do it on your own unless someone bigger is actually backing you. It can be Russia, it can be China, it can be the United States, or it can be the regional hegemon like Saudi Arabia or Iran. So in case of Bangladesh, we saw that Mujib was actually not backed by any specific hegemon of that time. So he had, somewhat good relationship with Soviet Union. He had very good and untrusting relationship with India. He wanted to be in the good books of the United States, but he was not. So it was a very muddled kind of international situation he was in. Hasina, on the other hand, now we are moving to the daughter, the failed father and successful daughter equation. Hasina basically did not repeat these two mistakes. Number one, she absolutely took the military into confidence. She made sure that they get the best bargains, best deal of the new political order. Okay, so these are like the new Nawabs of Bangladesh, who are enjoying a very good, very, very secure life. And in return, they work as Hasina's Praetorian guards. And number two, she has actually managed to get not one, but at least 3 international hegemons to back her. Since at least 2013 onwards. So we have India, India, and especially the BJP government of India, which is one of the key sponsors of Hasina regime, internationally. We have China, that is, bankrolling these massive development projects in Bangladesh. And, a good part of that development money actually goes into the pockets of Army League leaders and army officers and whatnot. And then we also have Russia. So, Hasina's is a fascinating game of, balancing. Sometimes, if we look at China versus India right now, one would wonder, what exactly is going on here? Here is one dictator who is actually backed by 3 sort of competing hegemons. But she has done that very successfully up until now. But I mean, with the recent sanctions against Rapid Action Battalion from the United States, things have started to change very slowly, going against her, I'd say. But going back to your question, I think that is where Sheikh Mujibur Rahman failed, and this is where Sheikh Hasina has succeeded. But obviously the context is also very important. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was indeed dealt a very bad hand, and Hasina, on the other hand, I mean, she inherited sort of a very stable political system, a loyal bureaucracy, a much more matured bureaucracy, and also a stable economy. Bangladesh has come a long way from 1972, and she has used that to her advantage.
That's also quite an interesting comparison with Indira Gandhi. Actually, I know that you were not in agreement with the comparison that I brought to the table earlier, but one of the conclusions of my conversation about Indira Gandhi a few months ago was that she also had quite a sophisticated view of foreign policy, and she was good at playing the Soviet Union and the Americans off against each other. The other power that I have, well, perhaps not power, but the other country that I've seen cozying up to Hasina is Britain. David Cameron met her in London a few years ago. Emily Thornberry, Labour politician, has described the Awami League in glowing terms. She said it's the sister party to the Labour Party. Do you know, I was just wondering, because of the nature of the audience for this podcast, do you know anything about the relationship between the British government and the Bangladeshi government?
Is there any dictatorship or an authoritarian in the world the British government doesn't like? I mean, that's one question I want to ask you. I mean, even with Putin, I mean, we know about the London laundromat, right? I mean,
sure, yeah.
London is the place where all the murderers of the world actually gather and resettle. I really don't think that Britain obviously has a long history in Bangladesh from the time of the Raj and all that. Hasina's niece, by the way, is a Labour Party MP, Tulip Siddiq. And she used to work for Awami League, though now she denies that. But I know it as a matter of fact that she used to work for Awami League. She even attended the meeting with me as a representative of Awami League. So that's how I know. Apart from that, Labour Party has been saying that it is a sister party, and then I think they actually withdrew that statement. David Cameron, I really don't know what exactly is his policy towards Hasina, but I have not seen the British government actually taking any strong position against any of the authoritarian governments anywhere in the world, really.
Apart from Putin, as you said, I think one thing about the Awami League and the Labour Party possibly is that the Bangladeshi immigrant population in Britain, especially in London, is very supportive of the Labour Party. So that could be a connection.
But the Bangladeshi population in England, I have recently been to London. I mean, the Bangladeshi population in London, if you talk about the majority, I mean, they hate Hasina. So that's
okay.
That's a very, and also, I mean, going back to the Putin reference, right? I mean, we have seen the sanctions that were imposed, right? I think earlier today. I mean, these are already parties and people who are already been sanctioned by United States, I think, months back.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a very strong position. So I really don't know. Like I'm not an expert on British foreign policy, but I mean from outside that is my view. I mean Britain actually never bothers about human rights of other countries.
What do the immigrant population, the Bangladeshi immigrant population in London say about Hasina?
I mean, most of them. There obviously is a UK branch of the Awami League who actually, very interestingly, helped Tuli Siddiq in her seat. They actually campaigned for her, though, I mean, it's supposedly illegal under British law, so they deny that whole thing, and the British press has actually not covered it. But I think most of the British Bangladeshis have a very negative view of Sheikh Hasina, what she is doing right now. Because, you cannot expect, British Bangladeshis are part of a democratic society, which is the United Kingdom, at least like up until now. You are lucky to have that. And they cannot see a kind of a police state ruling over their relatives back in their homeland. So obviously they're very, very critical. But yeah, again, I mean, people are extremely wary of criticizing Sheikh Hasina or the government very publicly. Because even if you are outside the country, like me, I mean, you have to be ready for immense level of attacks against you.
Perhaps it shows the Labour Party's lack of success in reading its own Bangladeshi voters.
Well, I mean, that can be. I mean, I have not seen any policy statements. I think Labour Forum for Human Rights was one organization that sort of tried to bring it into discussion, but I have not seen, much of it. And also, I think, like the left, the leftist part of British politicians, British political sphere, and also the leftist intellectuals, they're not actually much keen on a country like Bangladesh, which is not necessarily a Western client, right? Like, as long as you are a Russian client or a Chinese client, I mean, they are not necessarily bothered with, like putting you under the lens. So that's one of the problems I think we have in the West. But also, I mean, I have not seen anything from the Conservative Party about what's happening here. Very interesting aside here. When Boris Johnson became the Prime Minister, the first people to actually go to number 10 Downing Street with a basket of mangoes were a delegation from the Bangladesh High Commission in London. So it was a personal gift from Sheikh Hasina to Boris Johnson. And the Deputy Foreign Minister of Bangladesh was all, like gaga about that. And he said, Boris Johnson becomes the Prime Minister of UK, and the first thing he's going to eat is our mangoes from Russia. It just reminds me of these scenes from the Queen and Abdul, like about the rotten mango and all that thing. But it was very funny. I mean, it's still, I mean, that kind of colonial relationship that exists there.
Just to finish the conversation, Tasneem, you remarked that your experience of imprisonment and torture in Bangladesh occurred under the BNP, not under
the BNP. It was a transitional government. It was a caretaker government, which was actually backed by the army at that time. So it was not BNP. It was not Awami League. It was the army. Army-led government. So
got you. Who do you sort of look to in Bangladesh now with hope? I mean, even if it's just kind of illusory hope. Who in the is there anybody in the political system that you look at who you think could lead Bangladesh towards a more democratic and free future, or do you think that actually that quite toxic alliance that's come between the government and the security services, do you think that's just inevitable within the political system now?
I think lots of things have changed since the United States imposed sanctions on Rapid Action Battalion just very recently on December 10th. That has really shattered the pact between the Army League and the security establishment. That I look at as a very, very positive thing. Since December 10th, there has not been one incident of extrajudicial execution and enforced disappearance. So, I mean, if the United States and the other Western liberal democracies are thinking of, very efficient tools for the defense of human rights in places like Bangladesh, I mean, this is a very interesting case study. Having said that, I mean, going back to your original question, I am an optimist. I always try to be, even like I have proven time and again I was proven wrong. But right now I look at this new political party called Gano Adhikar Parishad, which is led by a former official of the IMF. His name is Dr. Reza Kibriya, and with him as a partner he has a young politician called Nurul Haq Noor. I really think, I mean, if we are to hope for a liberal, democratic Bangladesh sometime in the future, these are the people I would put my money on, really. But you never know. Like it's a very, as you said, it's a very volatile situation. These people have to work under immense level of repression and pressure, and you cannot blame them if they fail somehow. But you have to credit them. At least they are trying right now.
Absolutely. Tasneem, thank you very much. That was great. Where can people find your work?
I'm currently the editor-in-chief of Netro News, which covers Bangladesh extensively. We are an investigative journalism outlet. We are a public journalism outlet. So people can go to netro.news to look at the reporting we do. I'm also the author of a book, a bit outdated, I would say, but that's on the history of state terror and death squads in South Asia. It's called Jallad, Death Squads and State Terror in South Asia. It came out from Pluto Press, and people can look that up if they're interested.
Tasneem, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.